Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest edition of BookTrib Live, a Merrill Moss Media production. Today, we're thrilled to chat with Jeffrey Pfeffer, author of the new book Leadership BS, Fixing Workplaces and Careers One Truth at a Time. In addition to being an author and co-author of 14 books and over 150 articles and book chapters, Jeffrey is also the Thomas D. II Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where he's taught since 1979. So, welcome. And before we start with our questions, would you mind bringing up our viewers to speed on Leadership BS and the main idea that the book tackles?
Sure. So I wrote this book because the leadership industry, which is this set of activities which includes the seminars and the in-company leadership development programs and the blogs and all of the stuff that goes on around the topic of leadership, is an enormous industry. It has existed for 60, 70, 80 years. It involves a lot of talented, hardworking people, and it is an industry by virtually any reasonable measure has completely failed. Employee engagement is low, trust in leaders is low. Many leaders, according to a study by the Center of Creative Leadership, are ineffective in their jobs. Many leaders are losing their jobs. If you ask companies, the companies themselves will say that their leadership development efforts are not producing the leaders that they need or as many leaders as they need. And so by the criteria of the companies, are we doing a good job developing leaders? No. By measures of workplace, job satisfaction, employee engagement, trust in leaders? No. Are the leaders themselves doing well? No. And so what Leadership BS was about is an attempt to understand how this industry has failed so completely for so long. And the answers, I think there are many answers, but one answer is that there is oftentimes a discontinuity or a disagreement or a discrepancy between what's good for the individual and his or her own career and what's good for the company in terms of its performance. And that's something that I think many people don't acknowledge. And I think the other problem is that we oftentimes confuse rare cases that are inspirational with what's really going on in the world. And so we confuse what we would like to see and what ought to be with what is. And because we don't pay attention to actually what is going on and the real path to success, we have this kind of, we live in this kind of fictional world in terms of at least the leadership work.
That's really interesting, and also a bit of real talk, I think, for many people who kind of might not be familiar with what exactly the leadership development industry really is. So how do you see those trends in leadership being weaker, especially in business, being related to all of these books that are coming out and inspirational videos and all that type of thing?
Well, I think so to take one example, my friend Robert Chapman, who runs Barry Waymiller, which is a very well-run, interesting conglomerate, and has, I think, a very unusual and very productive and good view, and his employees, I think, are engaged, has written a book on leadership. But it's one of the questions that he doesn't ask, and I can't get him to ask, is not, is this a good thing to do the way you're managing, which, by the way, it is, but how common is it? And if it isn't common, why isn't it? So the analogy I often use is to medicine. In medicine, we know doctors ought to wash their hands, and that's interesting. But what's more interesting is what percentage of doctors do wash their hands, and what are the interventions that could increase the rate of hand washing. In the leadership industry, we know what people ought to do, but we never ask the question of how many of them are doing it. And we seldom ask the question of our interventions that we are talking about, the books, the blogs, the training programs, whatever, increasing the frequency of productive leadership behaviors. And if you never know how well you're doing, it is impossible to get better. Which is, I think, one of the answers to the question of why this industry has so completely failed for so long.
Wow, that's pretty interesting, but also a bit of a bleak point of view to a certain extent. What advice would you give for leaders who are trying to ride that line between functioning realistically and idealistically in a business world that maybe some of them are trying to improve?
Well, the advice I think I would get them is to get rid of the idealism. I don't think idealism necessarily gets you so far, get you very far. I mean, I think, and I don't think it's a bleak view at all. I mean, in medicine, years ago, you could not cure many cancers, and you could say, wow, this is very bleak. and you could tell stories that you were actually doing better than you were. But those stories, of course, number one, wouldn't be true, and number two, wouldn't cause you to do anything any differently or improve. The only way you're going to get better is to actually understand the truth. Where are we? How are we doing? And if we're not doing as well as we should, what are we going to do to make it better? Not to tell ourselves stories about how we would like the world to be, or tell ourselves stories about how well we're doing when we're not. The only way you get better is by understanding the true facts of the situation. So I don't find this particularly bleak. I mean, I find it bleak that we want to live in some kind of not fictional world that has almost no resemblance to reality.
Well, I completely agree with what you're saying, and maybe bleak is not the right word for it. But moving on, I want to ask. This book is all about leadership, and you've discussed in it like the idea that we celebrate certain qualities in leaders that can actually be bad for leadership. And I wanted to ask you to unpack the idea and describe some of those qualities for some of our viewers.
Sure. So, I mean, and I wrote a fortune column about this also. I mean, we talk about how we want our leaders to be modest, how we want our leaders to be authentic, how we want our leaders to tell the truth, how we want our leaders to build trust. These are all wonderful qualities, and there's no question that the world would be a better place if leaders did this. But one of the problems is that we need to look at who we actually reward and what are the behaviors that actually get rewarded inside of companies. And we know from studies of narcissism and self-aggrandizement and self-promotion that, in fact, modesty doesn't do you very much good. That if you want to get to the top, you need to be you need to look out for yourself. You need to take care of yourself, and maybe you even need to promote yourself more than many people are comfortable doing. We say we want people who tell the truth, but actually, in many respects, we don't. We reward people who don't tell the truth. And it's not just in politics, though, by the way, it's obviously there. I mean, all you have to do is turn on the TV and watch people saying things that they know aren't true as they say them. I mean, many of the people who've denied climate change understand that climate change is there. I think many of the people will make statements about both themselves and their opponents that they know are not completely factually accurate. That's why the St. Petersburg newspaper a long ago started this organization on fact-checking with their various scales like liar, liar, pants on fire, and whatever. But it's not just in politics where people don't tell the truth. And by the way, we don't want to know the truth. When students ask me, how well are they doing? How smart are they? They don't necessarily want the truth. They want to be told how wonderful they are. So in many instances, we don't want to hear the facts, which is one of the reasons why this goes on. So what's ironic or interesting or fascinating, and I think what's worthy of even more exploration, is how and why we say we want certain qualities. But if you look at who we reward and promote, there are people who have almost the opposite set of qualities. And you can look even at the fact-checking thing out of the St. Petersburg newspaper, put out did a column in the Sunday New York Times of which of the presidential candidates at the moment had basically been the most accurate and which of them had told the most fibs, and it's almost completely inversely correlated to their popularity in the polls. So Donald Trump and Ben Carson are the least honest and truthful, and they're of course sitting on top of the polls. So we are responsible for the leadership climates that we have created. So we say we want people who are modest and self-effacing, but we don't actually promote those people or are attracted to them. We say we want people who tell the truth, but in many instances we reward and vote for and hire and promote people who are willing to spin the truth. So that would be that's two examples. It's also true, I think, for other qualities such as authenticity. We actually don't want people who are authentic to themselves. We want people who are authentic to us and what we want them and need them to be at the moment.
Yeah, in previous interviews, because before this interview I went ahead and I watched some things that you said, you discussed the idea of how we need to change not ourselves necessarily to be leaders, but we need to change our behavior. And one question that I'm really interested in is what's the real difference between those two? Because to me, they seem to be quite similar. So, I mean, what's your take on that?
The take on the difference between ourselves and our behaviors?
To a certain extent. I mean, I remember I was watching an interview you were doing, and you were discussing a colleague of yours who was very introverted, but then started acting very outgoing in order to become a business leader. And I think she was going to become a university president or a provost. And I was like, but if she's changing her behavior, isn't she in some essence changing herself? It's an interesting concept.
If you change your behavior long enough, you become a slightly different person, but you don't. Amy Cuddy now has this new book out called Presence, which talks about faking it until you become it, and I think that's partly the truth, and I think the research on which this is based is certainly correct. So this idea that you need to be true to yourself, I don't know what that means. I mean, it's. Is this yourself as a parent or as a spouse, or is it yourself as a work person? Is it yourself when you were 16 or yourself when you're 36 or 46? So you have many selves. And so what I think you need to be true to is not who you think you are, but the set of skills and behaviors that you need to build in order to get you to the position that you want to occupy. So if a university president or university dean's position requires you to be outgoing and extroverted, you need to engage in those behaviors regardless of how you may feel about that. If you're in a marketing job and you need to do a lot of meeting and networking, even if you're not a natural networker, that doesn't really matter. You need to meet the people that you need to meet in order to be effective in the job that you've got. So this is less about being true to yourself and more about being true to the characteristics and the activities that will make you successful given the job and the people that you need to interact with.
That's really interesting, and I'm just really fascinated by the idea of choosing a profession that maybe is adverse to some things that you find yourself attracted to in your own personal life. But anyway, I just want to move on and ask a couple questions about the process of writing this book. I wanted to ask, what was that process like, and does writing about a topic that is clearly a little bit frustrating for you, not to put words in your mouth, did that make it harder or easier to write this book?
I think it made it easier. I think I, for one, I don't know if this is true for everybody, but I, for one, I'm often motivated by being irritated. So at one point I read a few posts and some blogs, and it was just clear to me that the people writing these were not really, they weren't doing anybody very much good, number one. But number two, they were hypocritical with respect to their own behavior, which is quite common in the leadership field, as I'm sure many people recognize. And number three, that if people actually took their advice, they would probably suffer career-ending events. And so one of the things that, so one of my commitments to my students at Stanford and to anybody who reads any of my material is that to the best of my knowledge, I'm going to tell you what I believe is useful for you to know to succeed in a world in which there is more competition than we often are willing to admit, and in which people are not always out for your best interest. They're out for their own best interests, which may or may not coincide with your best interest. So my job is to get my students ready so that they never have to leave a job involuntarily. And so therefore I was strongly motivated to write a book that told the truth about the behaviors that we necessarily don't like or respect. And number two, this book, as I describe in the preface, is really a prequel to my book called Power, Why Some People Have It and Others Don't, which is the text for my class. People would say, the things you're talking about in Power seems to conflict with this leadership literature, with all the things we've been told about leadership. How do you reconcile the two? And so I decided to try to reconcile the two by looking at these qualities and finding that they're not really very useful, even though we think they are.
That's really interesting. And you've already answered one of my questions before I even asked it, because I was going to ask how your relationships or your teaching, your relationships with your students have inspired this book or may have informed it in some way. And it seems as though you were having questions from your students, and this book is the answer to that.
Yep, I think that's right. Certainly at Stanford, we have a lot of classes taught by my colleagues that my wife would call kumbaya leadership. It's like we're all going to sit around and, sing songs and everything's going to be nice, which is, by the way, not how the way the world is, in case people haven't been reading the newspaper or looking at the news on their computer screen. And so the students would say the material in your class and the material in your book on power is in conflict with what we've learned in these other classes. And so I felt I owed them an explanation for why. And an explanation is all my work is based upon the social science evidence, not just about my opinion or experience or some anecdotal cases, but based upon a lot of systematic research which has been done now for years in social psychology and sociology. And I thought they deserved to understand how the advice they were being given in many of these other classes was simply not going to get them very far, and is in fact going to get them into trouble.
Wow. And I think that's an admirable thing. But right now, I'd like to take a question from one of our viewers. Susan, I'm going to pop this on the screen, asks, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about leadership and how to execute it properly? I think this is something that you address in the book, and why don't you go ahead and give it a shot?
I think the biggest misconceptions are that if you do what the leadership industry tells you to do, it's going to make you successful personally in your career, which I think it will not. I think we underestimate the extent to which engaging in strategic misrepresentation, which is a nice way of saying not telling the complete truth, the whole truth all the time, is actually important in many business contexts. So there was a survey done that asked the following question of marketing and salespeople: how often do you misrepresent the qualities of your product, and how often do you misrepresent the quality of competitors' products? And the answer, of course, is often. A colleague of mine who runs a magazine called Talent Quarterly did a survey of human resource executives and asked them to say, if someone works in your organization, like Katie's working in my organization, and Katie's a good worker, doing great, I want to keep her, but the odds of her getting promoted are close to zero, am I going to tell her that? In 75% of the cases, I think the actual number was 74% of the cases, the company said, no, we're not going to tell people their honest chances of being promoted because we want to keep them and we want to keep them motivated. Those are just two contexts. In negotiations, over buying and selling things, most people are not going to tell you exactly what their reservation price is, exactly the lowest price at which they will sell the product or the highest price at which they will buy it. So I think there's a lot of misconception about, our desire for honesty, our ability to deliver honesty. So that would be one, but I think there are many. I think most of the qualities that we claim we want in leaders, the modesty, authenticity, telling the truth, building trust, actually get in the way, I think, of leaders not only being effective for themselves, but even being effective for their own organizations.
Interesting. And this kind of leads into one of the topics that I wanted to bring up, that it isn't necessarily focused on leadership per se, but kind of on leaders in the workplace culture. You've thrown around this statistic, which I find astounding, but this idea that 120,000 deaths annually can be attributed to workplace stress. And I wanted to ask you, workplace leaders and employees, where does the burden of relieving workplace stress lie? Should it fall on leaders or employees? And the difference there being like, should it and does it? Like, what's the difference there? If that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. I actually think that leaders in workplaces should see themselves, but I think for the most part they don't, as stewards of their lives. So my friend Bob Chapman, I think he believes that people who come to work with Barry Waymiller, that they have entrusted not only their economic well-being, but parts of their psychological well-being and mental and physical health to him and to his colleagues, and therefore they feel an obligation to act as stewards of these human beings and of their lives. I don't think many leaders think of that way, because if they did, they wouldn't lay people off and create all this economic insecurity and continually cut healthcare benefits.
Hello? Can you hear me?
You might have is whether or not these people are, whether or not there's a role for government and government intervention.
Just so you know, I think you may have dropped out in the middle of that question, at least on my end.
You still there?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Jeffrey? Hello? You there?
Hello?
You there? Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Hold on, everybody. I think we're having some technical difficulties, so bear with
I
us
can
for a
hear you.
moment.
Are you back?
Yep, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. I apologize for that, everybody. I think that for some reason something just popped out for a moment there, but we are back here with Jeffrey Pfeffer. I'm sorry, but I missed a good chunk of your answer to that last question. I don't know if you're okay with reiterating some of what you just said about, the differences between where the burden of workplace stress relief lies. Do you mind just going over what you said?
Sure. I mean, I think the burden, I think I think good leaders understand that they're stewards of other people's lives, but there aren't very many people who adopt that position and that posture. And so if I think people should not expect their organizations to take care of them. For 40 years, organizations have been telling people that they are responsible for their own lives and their own careers. You want to take that seriously. And if we want to cut the enormous healthcare costs and death toll that comes from workplace stress, if leaders aren't going to do anything about this, there may be a role for governmental intervention, as there has been for things such as secondhand smoke. And by the way, we also did a study which shows that in general, many workplace exposures, things like economic insecurity, long work hours, work-family conflict, etc., are as dangerous and hazardous to your health as secondhand smoke.
Wow, and I think that's a statistic that many people will be very surprised to learn about. But in retrospect, I think people think about some of the jobs that they've left. It might make a lot of sense. What advice would you give for employees who are looking for practical solutions to reduce some of those stressors, or for leaders trying to reduce their stresses on their employees? Or is that something that shouldn't really matter to them because everybody should be taking care of themselves?
I think people need to take care of themselves. One of the things I think employees should do is they ought to evaluate the jobs and the job opportunities that they have, not just in terms of salary or whatever, but also in terms of how well it fits the skills that they think they're good at. To go back to this leadership and power subject for a little nanosecond, if you like the doing power, I just had lunch before I got on the show program with you, with a woman who loves networking, loves promoting herself, loves putting herself out there. Fine, that's great. She needs to find a job which has which plays to those strengths. If you don't have those as strengths and you're not interested in doing that, then you shouldn't fool yourself about being in a job that does not match your particular capacities, capabilities, and interests. And I do think, particularly for people working in today's world, given what the human resource people have said for decades about people needing to be responsible for their own career and take care of themselves, they've told you that for 40 years. You got to take that message seriously. The idea that you should rely on your employer to look out for your interests, I think is just insane, because they don't.
And I think that anybody who reads Leadership BS will know exactly how true that is. And kind of going along with that, I want to take a question that seems relevant from one of our viewers. Mel asks, let me just pop this on the screen there. How can you better a poor relationship with your boss in the workplace? Do you have any practical tips for this?
Yeah, sure, of course. The simple answer is to flatter your boss endlessly and shamelessly, and to never disagree with your boss, which you should never do anyway, and to continually, remind the boss how brilliant they are, he or she is, so people, it's interesting. I think it was Maya Angelou, or could be somebody else, who said people don't remember necessarily what you say, but they remember how you made them feel. And I think that's a very important insight about interpersonal relationships. So the question is, if I interact with Katie, at the end of this interaction, do I feel better about myself or not? And so your objective, if I'm your boss, is to make sure that every interaction, at the end of that, I feel better about myself. And also, by the way, about you. But if you make me feel better about myself, I will also feel better about you.
That's really interesting. And something that I think about when you say that is, what if the boss or the person in power that might not be particularly a boss, might be some other person who you're working with in your workplace. What if that person is a workplace bully who you're trying to get close to? Like, do you have any ideas about this idea of workplace bullying? It's something that I'm interested in. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I think, look, the world is not going to always put in your workplace environment, or for that matter, in any of your environments, except environments that you choose, like the person you're with or something, you're not always going to have in your workplace environment people that you like, or people that you respect, or people that you admire, or people that you necessarily think are intelligent or deserve their position or anything else. But in the words of my good friend Gary Loveman, who for many years ran Caesars, formerly called Harrah's, the casino company, critical relationships have to work. So if you and I work together, if you're my boss, if you're a coworker on whom my job performance depends, this relationship has to work. And it has to work regardless of what I think about you, and regardless of what my judgments are about, whether you deserve your job or not or anything. So I would say get rid of all these judgments. The only judgment you ought to make is Katie someone who I need to get along with? And if Katie's someone I need to get along with, then that relationship needs to work, and it's my responsibility to do as much as I can to make sure that that relationship is successful. Because otherwise I'm not going to be able to be effective in doing my job.
I really like that take because I feel like it's a very sort of realistic take that you don't often get from many people in the leadership development industry. And I know we only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask, what's the biggest lesson that you hope your readers gain at the end of Leadership BS once they finished it? Like, what's the one thing you hope they take from the book, if nothing else?
That life isn't that the world of work and that the world of life is about trade-offs. And that we have this unidimensional view. I can do things that are good for me. It's also good for the company. All the measures of effectiveness are all lined up one with the other. That isn't true. The world is a complex, multidimensional place. Many measures of outcomes and performance are not perfectly correlated with each other. And what's good for you and what's good for the organization are not necessarily correlated for and with each other. And so what I would hope my listeners and readers would do is build a more realistic, but also a more complicated and thoughtful view of the social world, and not oversimplify stuff, and not live in this kind of made-up fairy tale world, which is fine for Saturday night movies, but which is not so good if it's going to cause you to suffer some kind of job loss because you don't understand the social dynamics going on around you.
Mm-hmm. Great. May I ask, what's your next project? Are you working on another book that's sort of related to these?
Yes. Actually, I'm working on a book with the working title of "Dying for a Paycheck," which directly addresses this issue of workplace stress and its consequences, and how many of the work practices that cause ill health effects are also not particularly good for the organizations that are doing them.
So the idea of Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. You asked me any idea of when it will be done? No. It should have been done months ago, but I'm working hard on it when I'm not interviewing with you.
Okay. Most people would not be like, where's the next book? So I don't think you need to worry about it. Just take your time, I guess. But what I was going to ask was the idea of workplace stress and poor workplace cultures not being great for companies' bottom lines, I think is a really interesting idea, and I'm really looking forward to reading what you have to say about it. But one more question, I think, just to wrap it up, which is a bit of a non sequitur, but something that I always love to ask authors. What books are you reading right now, or what books were you reading at the time that you were writing Leadership BS? Just out of curiosity.
I read a lot of social science articles. I don't read that many social science books. Most of the books I read are like pulp fiction is the only way to describe it, because I often do that reading on airplanes, and so I read mystery novels and thrillers. So Stephen King and Tammy Hogue and all these people who write about blood and guts. That's kind of what That's what I read for fun. And professionally, oftentimes I don't read books. I read the articles. So, for instance, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a New Yorker article, How David Beats Goliath. It's a fabulous article. I highly recommend it. He then expanded that into a book. So many books are just articles with too much filler in them. So I try to read the basic ideas. Amy Cuddy's book, Presence, which I think is a fabulous book, is based upon an article on power posing that she did with a colleague of mine, Dana Carney, and a third person. If you read the article, you basically get the essence of what power posing is about. You don't need to read the entire book.
Or watch the TED Talk, which is also fantastic.
Well, the TED Talk is painless. It's good.
Yeah, it's very happy. But yeah, I think it's pretty cool that you read a lot of mystery and bloody thrillers. I wouldn't expect that, but now that you said it in retrospect, it kind of makes sense. So yeah, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time with Jeffrey. Thank you everybody for joining us, and don't forget to check out Leadership BS. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeffrey. This has been a really interesting and intriguing talk. Hopefully we can do it again soon when that next book comes out. I would love to talk to you again about it. So thank you so much, everybody, and see you next time in BookTrib Live.